2025 was an incredible year for the movie industry. Not because of great movies, but because of how much money Hollywood managed to set on fire. Hundreds of millions of dollars, big studios, big stars, serious directors, and somehow absolute box office disasters. This wasn't one bad movie, this was a pattern. Streaming projects that cost more than skyscrapers. Sequels that nobody actually wanted. Prestige films critics loved and audiences completely ignored. Some of these movies were dead on arrival. Others were buried a year before release. So today, we're breaking down the biggest box office failures of 2025. What went wrong, who dropped the ball, and how Hollywood keeps repeating the same mistakes. And trust me, by the time we get to the final one, you'll understand why this year was special. Let's start with Netflix's flop, The Electric State. Originally, the project lived at Universal and was supposed to be a straight-up theatrical release. But after they spent a couple of years messing with the script, Universal finally tapped out because they couldn't get the budget down to something that wouldn't require selling a kidney. The movie is based on the work of artist Simon Stålenhag, and in the proud tradition of Hollywood adaptations, by the time it hit the screen, basically only the title survived from Stålenhag's original vibe. After Universal refused, the project slid over to Netflix, which agreed to throw in $200 million like it was loose change in the couch. The Russo brothers were hired to direct, the guys who once delivered several movies about little dudes in tights, including Avengers Endgame. They shot the film in 2022. Then in 2023, it turned out that in 2022 they shot not a great film, so they had to reshoot it, twice. How much did they reshoot? Nobody really knows. Some reports claim they redid 80% of the movie. Others say 30 or 40. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, like always. The final budget landed around $320 million. And once you know that, every single metric on the platform starts looking like a horror story. It pulled 25 million views in the first week. That's less than most of Netflix's louder 2025 releases. Way less. For comparison, the thriller Carry On did 42 million in a week. Back in Action did 47, and even The Union with Marky Mark managed 40. And the biggest budget among those? Back in Action at 120 million, which is still basically half off compared to The Electric State. So when you look at those numbers side by side, The Electric State starts to resemble, if not Netflix's single biggest disaster ever, then absolutely one of the biggest. And honestly, if this thing had gone to theaters, it probably would have been the biggest flop of 2025. But because it's streaming, Netflix can hide behind the fog machine. There's no clean way to calculate profit or loss, so everyone just argues on Twitter and moves on. And the next category of flops belongs to movies that nobody asked for. The kind of movies that get made for unclear reasons, for unclear audiences, and then once they hit theaters, their giant budgets earn just enough to cover gas money. Who keeps making these and why? No idea, but they never stop. One of them is The Alto Knights from Barry Levinson. It used to be called Wise Guys, then Goodfellas, and now it's The Alto Knights. They've been renaming it since the Carter administration. Levinson, to be fair, once made Rain Man, Sleepers, Disclosure, and then he made Sphere, and basically sealed that negative momentum with Bandits, which performed even more negatively. After that, Barry mostly pivoted into making Robert De Niro and Al Pacino movies in various combinations, like a chef who learned 2 ingredients and refuses to touch anything else. The Alto Knights is another one of those. And yes, it has Robert De Niro again. The difference is the budget. Not a couple dollars like some of De Niro's more recent projects, but a whole $45 million. This thing was in development hell forever. Studios wanted to make it since the mid-70s, right after The Godfather came out. And suddenly, every executive in America needed to finance their own personal mafia fantasy. Warner finally decided to throw money at it only in 2022. And it finally limped into theaters in 2025. Standard procedure followed. After shooting, it had to sit on a shelf for a while. Translation: they didn't know what they had and they were scared to release it. Then they finally dumped it into theaters and it collected a heroic $9 million. Another movie like that is The Smashing Machine with Dwayne Johnson. If the uselessness of the Alto Knights and its failure were obvious years in advance, The Smashing Machine was a little trickier. Nobody expected a Dwayne Johnson movie to flop like that. The assumption was that Dwayne would still interest somebody, a big star with the permanent super prefix attached to his name. They even started handing him awards in advance for taking a role that's unusual for him, like he'd just discovered acting. Everyone praised him for being a big, brave, good boy. But once the movie actually hit theaters, it turned out nobody was waiting for it. With a $50 million budget, it earned only 19. There's still a chance Dwayne wins some prize for being a good boy, and then the whole thing won't look quite as horrifying. Margot Robbie, after the surprising success of Barbie, did what she's apparently best at, starring in movies that nobody needs. This time she flopped with A Big, Bold, Beautiful Journey. Early on, people expected a lot. Awards talk, important film of the year, the whole prestige package. That's probably why Margot signed on, but once she did, the movie stopped being important. And suddenly, nobody expected anything from it anymore. They spent $50 million on the film and collected only 18 at the box office. And the most unnecessary film of the year was Better Man. Yes, there's a singer named Robbie Williams. And yes, this is a biopic about the fact that he could sing. Everything would have been fine, except the budget was $110 million. And instead of Robbie Williams, the movie features a monkey. That was the singer's idea. Apparently, that's what they called him as a kid, and he decided it would be better that way. Someone actually listened. It cost $110 million. At the box office, it collected only 22. Two reasons usually get blamed for this epic faceplant. First, nobody's really heard about Robbie Williams since the 2000s, and somebody massively overestimated his cultural relevance. Plenty of people heard Robbie Williams biopic and genuinely asked, who? Second, the monkey. A lot of people admit it doesn't sound terrible as a concept, but watching it seriously for 2 hours is a lot. And the budget inflated like crazy because of that gimmick. The audience rating, by the way, isn't even bad. It's just that too many butts piled up. And when people saw all those butts, they didn't bother showing up. Robbie Williams only has serious competition for first place from Luca Guadagnino's new film, After the Hunt. Critics love Luca. He's behind prestige favorites like Queer and Call Me By Your Name. And his new film was once again supposed to be very important, because the core of the story is harassment. It's a movie about Andrew Garfield getting accused of harassment, while Julia Roberts is suspecting something at the same time. Roberts was paid $20 million for this. The rest of the salaries weren't announced, but it was reported that the actors got their max rates. Maybe another $10 to $15 million went to everyone else. That would explain the $70 million budget, because otherwise it's genuinely hard to understand what they spent that much money on. And the film collected only $9 million in theaters. Of course, the flop gets blamed on the cosmic budget for this kind of drama. If the film had been great, in theory, you could recoup it. But even in Hollywood's best years, it would have been an uphill climb. And on IMDb, the average audience score is 5 out of 10. Paramount's biggest flop of 2025 was The Running Man, starring the newest officially appointed superstar, Glenn Powell. After Anyone But You and Twisters, the studio credited him with those films' success and immediately started calling him the future of Hollywood, a major star and an undeniable talent, which is exactly why expectations for The Running Man were so high. In reality, the film ended up grossing only slightly more than Arnold Schwarzenegger's original The Running Man. And if you factor in inflation, the comparison becomes outright embarrassing. The new Running Man is about as close to the old one as the moon is to Earth. The funny thing is, the movie itself had no obvious problems. It was directed by Edgar Wright, known for Scott Pilgrim vs. the World and Baby Driver. The production cost $110 million and it managed to gross only $69 million. The studio blamed the whole thing on a weak marketing campaign and Glenn Powell himself. The general assumption became that with a different lead actor, the movie could have made more, but the newest superstar failed to interest anyone at all. Maybe someone else could have pushed it higher. Or maybe not. We'll never know. These days, horror is considered one of the safest and most in-demand genres. Budgets are usually kept under control and the returns are often excellent. But in 2025 tried to rewrite that rulebook. Right at the start of the year, Wolfman flopped. a film that was supposed to be one of the year's major horror releases. It was directed by Lee Wannell, who previously made Insidious, Upgrade, and The Invisible Man, all successful films. Largely because of that track record, Wannell is seen as a major talent, and expectations for Wolfman were high. Some people might remember Universal's long-running obsession with launching a classic monsters universe. First, they tried with Van Helsing, then with Tom Cruise's The Mummy. After those failures, the studio decided to take a more careful approach. Smaller films, lower budgets, gradual build-up. And the idea was that the new Wolfman would be the first swallow. And if it worked, they'd officially call it the beginning of that long-dreamed-of monsters universe. Something similar happened years ago with Dracula Untold starring Luke Evans. They never officially labeled it a franchise launch either, but everyone kept repeating the word, if. And now, once again, people prepared themselves for the idea that this time it would finally work. That Wolfman would kick everything off, or at least that Wannell wouldn't let them down. Reality had other plans. With a $25 million budget, the supposed franchise launch earned only $34 million. Once marketing costs were factored in, the film ended up losing money. So the universe will now be launched some other time, possibly with the exact same outcome. At this point, it genuinely feels like that universe is cursed. They can't seem to launch it for the fourth or fifth time. And now we get to one of the two biggest flops of 2025. A Disney film, the continuation of Tron from 2010. Fans begged for a sequel for years and Disney eventually took pity. The film largely exists thanks to Jared Leto. At first, the studio explored options for a more direct continuation of Tron Legacy. But in 2014, Jared Leto won an Oscar and was immediately crowned a massive superstar. That's when he convinced Disney to make a Tron movie about Jared Leto. He was even appointed as a producer. He reportedly received several $1 million for the lead role, and roughly the same amount for producing duties, though exact numbers were never disclosed. From the mid-2000s onward, the film began its long, painful journey to the big screen. The script was rewritten around 10 times. Someone was always unhappy. And over time, it slowly became obvious that Jared Leto wasn't actually needed by anyone. That realization fully crystallized after the flop of Morbius. Unfortunately, by then it was extremely difficult to cancel the project. Several million had already been spent on the script. Pre-production was in full swing, and expensive sets had already been built. Pulling the plug at that point would have meant flushing $30 or $40 million straight down the drain. As often happens in Hollywood, if they'd known how it would end, stopping earlier would have been smarter. But they didn't. Still, it seems the studio was counting heavily on the box office performance of Legacy. After Tron 3 finally came out, even more interesting details started surfacing. Supposedly, director Joachim Running didn't want to shoot the film using the script that eventually became Tron Ares. He tried to convince the studio to go with a different script written by James Butterworth, the writer behind Edge of Tomorrow, Spectre, and more. But the studio insisted on the version by Jesse Wigatow, who had an entire series behind him, Daredevil Born Again. Jared Leto also preferred that script. Running reportedly tried to get out of the project, but was pulled back in with contractual threats. You can imagine the level of enthusiasm that followed. The movie cost $220 million and grossed $142. Once marketing costs are included, Disney is reportedly staring at losses of around $200 million. The next flop was the newest Predator installment. It was assembled after the massive success of Prey. Success, of course, on streaming. Critics were ecstatic. By average rating, it became the best-reviewed Predator film in the franchise. Audience scores were lower, but still solid. Based on that, the new film was given a theatrical release, with the expectation that the success would transfer. It didn't. Even the PG-13 rating, the first in the franchise's history, because failed to help. Still, this flop wasn't as catastrophic as many others on this list. With digital sales and streaming factored in, Predator Badlands will probably turn a profit. Whether that's true will become obvious once they announce a sequel, or don't. The movie grossed $184 million on a budget of $105 million. Another freshly crowned superstar, Jenna Ortega, also managed to flop across the board in 2025. She did have one clear success, Wednesday, with its second season. It was after the first season that she was officially declared a star, and it increasingly looks like she doesn't interest audiences in any other role. Her flops were relatively small because of the budgets involved, but even modest budgets proved too heavy for new star power. Early in the year, she flopped with Death of a Unicorn. With a $15 million budget plus marketing costs, it grossed only 16. After that, The Last Tomorrow sank as well, and dragged The Weeknd down with it. He's one of the biggest singers in the world right now, but for some reason, none of his fans want to watch him act in a movie. He clearly wanted to say something with the film. He helped write the script and even served as a producer. Together with Jenna Ortega, the film collected a stunning $7 million on a $15 million budget. Established important directors also flopped without a chance this year. Critics were in heaven, audiences were not. One of those was Ari Aster's Eddington. After Hereditary and Midsommar, Aster was crowned a visionary talent and started receiving bigger budgets. And now he flops with every new project. Last year it was Beau is Afraid. This year it was Eddington. The film cost $35 million and earned only 17. Yorgos Lanthimos followed with Bugonia. For him, Bugonia became his second flop in a row after the success of Poor Things in 2023. In 2024, Kinds of Kindness sank. In 2025, it was Bugonia's turn. It became his most expensive film to date, with a $55 million budget, and it grossed only 40. In 2025, Megan 2.0 managed to completely destroy a budding franchise. In 2022, the original Megan cost $12 million and grossed $182 million worldwide. An absolutely massive success. For the sequel, they increased the budget to $25 million, and it grossed only 34. The filmmakers here deserve either a Genius Award or a lifetime ban. The original Megan was a horror film, like specifically a horror film made for women. Almost 70% of its theatrical audience was women. For the sequel, the creators decided to turn it into a sci-fi action movie with the same ridiculous dolls. Unsurprisingly, women didn't show up, and it also turned out to be very difficult to convince men to watch a former horror movie that had turned into a doll-based action flick. If there were an end-of-year award for the biggest idiots in the industry, the creators of Megan 2.0 would have been strong contenders. Steven Soderbergh's Black Bag also flopped. It grossed $44 million on a $60 million budget. And in this case, the most entertaining part of the story came from the director himself. Soderbergh commented on the flop and explained that box office failures of movies like this are actively harming cinema. According to him, he made the exact same kind of film he used to make. The kind of film that gave us Ocean's 11, Aaron Brockovich, and Traffic. But audiences simply don't go to theaters anymore, and he genuinely doesn't understand what he's supposed to do about that. Critics, meanwhile, are absolutely thrilled. He cast big stars just like he always did, but for some mysterious reason it didn't help this time. What's always fascinating in moments like this is how people in that position say these things completely seriously. Do they really not understand that Cate Blanchett has never been the kind of star people buy movie tickets for? And that if she had starred in Aaron Brockovich, the outcome might have been very different? Or if Michael Fassbender had replaced Brad Pitt in Ocean's 11, and someone like Rebecca Ferguson had been cast instead of Julia Roberts in Aaron Brockovich. Something very strange might have happened as well. The quality of those films probably wouldn't have suffered at all, but the box office prospects 30 years ago absolutely would have. And if you look at the numbers, the situation becomes even clearer. Black Bag has an average critic score of 8.1 out of 10 and an audience score of 6.7. That's not a masterpiece, that's a frankly mediocre film. For comparison, Ocean's 11 has a 7.7 audience score and a 7.0 critic score. So maybe the real issue is that Black Bag is a completely disposable movie made primarily for critics. There's something for them, but nothing for a general audience. Which is why the audience isn't interested, and it stars actors who have never been box office draws. But, of course, the movie isn't flopping because people don't want to watch the 999th mediocre spy thriller rated 5 or 6 out of 10. No, it's failing for completely different cosmic reasons. Because Steven just can't understand. Director Darren Aronofsky also went under with his new film. Caught Stealing cost $45 million and collected only $32 at the box office. The Accountant 2, starring Ben Affleck, also failed to recoup. The first film, released in 2016, performed well. It grossed $160 million on a $44 million budget. The sequel, however, cost $80 million and earned only $103. Warner Brothers released the first film, but the sequel was bought by Amazon, and Amazon is the company that sent The Accountant 2 into theaters, despite owning one of the largest streaming platforms in the world, which means theatrical performance isn't really the point. That's why the flop of The Accountant 2 is officially framed as advertising for the streaming service. In other words, Amazon doesn't actually need theatrical success. It uses theaters as a marketing tool, tossing certain films into cinemas so people later recognize them on the platform. Animation, overall, had a very strong year with one major exception. The $150 million Elio flopped, and according to rumors, the real budget may have exceeded $200 million, which makes the situation even more dramatic. The failure is usually blamed on two things. First, a weak marketing campaign. They simply failed to reach the audience. But the main issue is much simpler. Elio is an original project. Audiences just don't show up for that anymore. They want sequels and prequels, and they run to those in massive crowds. Studios now openly say that after COVID, there's been a radical shift in audience behavior, and that shift directly affects what gets greenlit. Original films and original animated projects are becoming harder and harder to justify because people don't watch them. It's much safer to make a remake of something everyone already recognizes. You could say that originality today is simply boring to audiences, but you don't even have to. Elio grossed $154 million on a budget somewhere between $150 and $200 million. Now to Warner Bros. The studio's first serious flop of 2025 was Mickey 17. The failure is usually blamed on the massive budget for a project like this. $118 million plus another $80 million spent on marketing. The film grossed $133 million. I'd add, though, that when a movie starts getting buried a full year before release, the problem usually isn't just the budget. It was buried because of test screenings, and those reportedly went badly. The studio, even sidelining director Bong Joon-ho, assembled its own cut of the film for test screenings, and according to rumors, that version performed better. Despite that, they released the director's cut in theaters because Bong Joon-ho's contract included final cut privileges. Bong later read articles claiming that Warner had a different version of Mickey 17 that scored 10 points higher in test screenings. He publicly stated that this was a lie, insisting that audiences rated his version higher than the studio cut, which is exactly why his version went to theaters, not the worst one, as some stories claimed. As usual, you can pick whichever side you prefer. We'll never know who's telling the truth. The second major Warner flop was One Battle After Another, directed by Paul Thomas Anderson and starring Leonardo DiCaprio. The film was also buried about a year before release, largely because of the director himself. Despite being adored by critics and having acclaimed films like There Will Be Blood and Magnolia behind him, not a single Anderson movie has ever grossed more than $80 million theatrically. The budget for One Battle After Another was $135 million, with rumors pushing it as high as $175, which, understandably, made a lot of people's eyes pop out of their skulls. Especially considering that DiCaprio hasn't been a guaranteed box office machine for quite some time now. But studios aren't run by complete idiots, even if it sometimes feels that way. Most likely because of the film's perceived importance, everyone understood the risks going in. Studios often operate on status, not just profit. One Battle After Another is exactly that kind of project. Still, reports claimed Warner was expecting $300 million in box office. That number wouldn't have made the film a success in a strict financial sense, but it would have been enough for the studio to shrug and say, okay. In the end, the movie grossed $205 million. Awards season is just around the corner. The film will receive nominations. It has already picked up Golden Globes, and with a bit of luck and a few shiny statuettes, the studio will quietly close its eyes to the flop, because the status benefits will outweigh the losses. And the biggest flop of the year was Disney's Snow White. This is usually the movie credited with the largest losses of 2025. The official budget sits at $250 million, and though reportedly it was even higher because the film was essentially shot twice. The test audience at the first screening couldn't handle it. Someone got beaten up, someone died. Not literally, but spiritually. So Disney had to reshoot the movie in 2023. The test screenings of the new version didn't go much better. In 2024, the film went through yet another round of reshoots, this time less massive. They lasted about a month and supposedly helped make the movie better. At least no more fatalities were reported at test screenings. All of this was constantly written about in the press. The release was delayed by an entire year, so the public funeral of Snow White started roughly 2 years before the movie actually came out. Maybe under different circumstances, it could have made a bit more money, but then the lead actress, Rachel Zegler, entered the equation. She stated that the original Snow White fairy tale is outdated, and that the prince is an abuser because he kissed Snow White without asking for consent. And that, of course, is unforgivable. Such horrors must be eradicated. Naturally, after comments like that, something caught fire somewhere, and mockery of the movie itself was quickly joined by open hostility toward its lead actress. Rachel didn't stop there. On her own social media, in posts promoting Snow White, she began posting political slogans related to Israel and Palestine. Since Gal Gadot also stars in the film, a conflict reportedly broke out between them, and during the smaller reshoots, which continued almost right up until the premiere, the actresses were filmed separately from each other. But even that wasn't enough for Rachel. She then went on to publicly wish a violent death on all supporters of Donald Trump. The chaos reignited instantly with even more intensity. Every Snow White trailer on YouTube was flooded with dislikes, breaking every record imaginable. Reports claimed that Snow White was originally considered a billion-dollar movie, but when Zegler delivered her first round of spontaneous PR, calling the prince in the original story an abuser, the studio didn't stop her. Someone decided that all press is good press and that extra publicity could only help. That turned out to be a massive mistake. After her later political statements, Disney reportedly sent producers to deal with her, trying to shut the situation down. It didn't work immediately, and by the time they finally managed to restrain her and calm things down, it was far too late. So with all that baggage attached, the film was released in theaters in spring 2025. With an official budget of $250 million, it grossed $205. That puts it in direct competition with Tron Ares for Disney's biggest flop of the year. However, Forbes and the New York Times argue that Disney is being a bit creative with the numbers, and that the real budget is closer to $300 million or more. The key factor here is the British tax rebate the film received. Snow White was shot in the UK and qualified for a 25% rebate, which requires the studio to officially report its spending. In theory, these documents are reviewed by UK government agencies, and you can't just write down whatever numbers you want. According to official British filings, the total spending on Snow White exceeded $370 million. That's the figure used to calculate the 25% rebate, which means that, after accounting for the rebate, Snow White should have cost Disney roughly $280 million. Add another $100 million for marketing, and Disney's losses on Snow White alone are estimated at somewhere between $200 and $300 million. It looks terrifying on paper. Across just 2 films, Snow White and Tron, Disney may have lost $400 to $500 million. But those numbers only look scary until you glance at the other side of the balance sheet. Because if you also remember that in just the past year alone, Stitch generated Disney more than $4 billion through consumer products, toy sales, and other merchandise, then all these catastrophic flops don't look so disastrous. And that's probably it for the box office disasters of 2025. That was Frameback. See you on the next Rewind.